Xtalks is the industry leader in connecting life science, food, healthcare, and medical device professionals. The Xtalks Life Science Podcast features insightful conversations with industry experts about all things pharma, biotech, and more.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Ayesha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at Xtalks.com. And this week, I'm delighted to introduce our special guest on the show for today. We have with us Nolan Townsend, who is the CEO of Lexeo Therapeutics, is a company developing genetic medicines for the treatment of conditions including cardiovascular diseases as well as rare diseases as well. Lexeo recently announced a partnership to advance cardiac RNA therapeutics as well as $80 million in equity financing. Nolan has been CEO of Lexeo Therapeutics since 2020, leading the company's mission to advance gene therapies for cardiovascular and genetic diseases. He previously held senior leadership roles at Pfizer, including president of rare disease for both North America and international markets. And he began his career in healthcare investment banking at Lehman Brothers. Nolan also serves on several boards, including Arbor Biotechnologies, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, as well as the Martha's Vineyard Museum, in addition to an appointment to the New York City Economic Development Corporation's Life Sciences Advisory Council. Nolan received his MBA from the Harvard Business School and his Bachelor of Arts in Economics from the University of Pennsylvania. To learn more about the work that Nolan is leading at Lexeo in the field of genetic medicines, cardiovascular diseases, let's turn to him now. Thank you so much for being on the show with us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you for the kind introduction.
It's a pleasure for us to have you and really looking forward to the conversation. And as I mentioned, that you've had quite a journey in the field from big pharma to smaller biotech, mid-sized, and really leading important efforts first in the rare disease space and now in cardiovascular disease. So I'd like to learn a bit more about those experiences, beginning with your work in rare disease at Pfizer and how you journeyed your way to Lexeo.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and thank you for asking. I mean, I'd first say I think I had a fantastic career experience, working at Pfizer. I think it's a great company. I think the scale of the healthcare challenges that Pfizer's in a position to address globally are, extremely important for the population of pretty much every country around the world. I spent time in Pfizer's, primary care business and its vaccines business, and worked across, the entire portfolio and pipeline. But as you mentioned, my last few roles were in senior leadership roles in Pfizer's rare disease business, where I got the opportunity to work both in the international markets and in North America. And I think through this work, I began to see the potential of whether it's gene therapies to treat, genetic mediated conditions, or whether it's other modalities to treat, rare diseases. And I think you develop a closeness to patient populations, understanding of the importance of some of these very serious diseases, many of them, pediatric rare diseases of, high unmet need, meaning these patients suffer from mortality pretty early in life. And I think patients in that setting are highly motivated to seek treatments and to partner with the companies developing these treatments to see these ultimately reach their children or themselves. So you see very strong patient advocacy groups that are very influential when working with pharmaceutical companies or biotech companies, or even with the FDA to see these therapies, rapidly advanced. So I think this fueled my passion, to see, patients that were so passionate about receiving therapies and benefiting from treatments, led me to say, well, is there a way that we can work to develop, novel treatments, innovative treatments to diseases that do not have them today? I think one of the benefits of having a rare disease business that sits within a larger pharmaceutical company is that this large pharmaceutical company would typically have global scale which would mean commercially we can deliver these rare disease treatments to pretty much every patient in the world that needs them. And that's one of the benefits of that scale. But I think one of the challenges of a rare disease business sitting within a large pharmaceutical company is that take a company with a $50 billion revenue line. There aren't many rare diseases that can really move the needle on such a revenue line, right? So they almost inherently can't be of the single greatest importance for that large pharmaceutical company. If you're working in a small company, either that does not have revenue yet or has more modest revenue, even small rare diseases and the peak revenue from those can be very meaningful for that company, meaning that company can focus on ensuring those patients, receive treatment. And that can be the single greatest focus of that company and its mission. So I think, starting and launching Lexeo, that was one of our primary goals, was to pursue treatments in diseases that did not have therapies ahead of them. And in some cases, these are rare disease treatments, rare diseases like Friedreich's ataxia, which is a very challenging disease. Most patients do not live beyond their third decade of life. Patients have struggled with this disease. It was first diagnosed over 20 years ago. The first treatment was just approved, last year, which means this population may not have gotten sufficient focus from the biopharmaceutical industry in terms of, advancing treatment options. So I think it was really up to smaller biotech companies to begin to develop treatments, in this disease area. The first approved treatment was developed by a company called Reata, another, clinical stage biotechnology company. The potential second treatment in this disease area is the one that we're developing here at Lexeo. So I think this is a good example of the type of innovation that the biotechnology industry can deliver, to society more broadly, but also, frankly, to rare disease populations. Now, I think what's interesting is that in a lot of cases, as these companies reach some stage of commercial maturity or some stage of pipeline maturity, ultimately they may be acquired by pharmaceutical companies, thereby allowing that therapy to access the global scale of the pharmaceutical company that ultimately acquires it. But I think for navigating some of the challenges in clinical development, some of the regulatory innovation that's required to get therapies like these to market, it may be that they're well suited to, clinical stage biotechnology companies to advance. And I think this is part of, what was important about the work we were doing at Lexeo. We started with a range of programs ranging from diseases like Friedreich's ataxia, through to Alzheimer's disease, leveraging experiences that range from, large market diseases like what I mentioned before in primary care, through to rare disease. We've applied some unique frameworks to, develop those therapies to their next logical milestone.
Thank you so much for sharing that very interesting and very insightful journey, and how really your perspectives on big pharma versus smaller biotechs, mid-sized biotechs, and really the opportunities in both spaces. So very, very insightful. And I'd like to learn a bit more about Lexeo. And I know the focus of the company is on developing genetic medicines, and not only for rare diseases, but also for cardiovascular diseases as well, which I think under the umbrella, they don't seem very rare, but within that space, definitely there are rare conditions as well. So could you talk to us a bit more about the genetic medicines focus and in the cardiovascular and rare disease space?
Yeah, so first I'll just outline our primary drug platform and drug delivery platform, let me say, and then talk about the cardiovascular space and the link to rare disease. So Lexeo's most advanced programs are what we call gene therapy, and gene therapy classically utilizes a non-pathogenic virus to deliver the corrected gene to treat the disease of focus. And in our case, we use a non-pathogenic virus called the adeno-associated virus, or AAV. This is the most commonly used virus from an in vivo gene therapy perspective to deliver, genetic payloads to specific organs, whether it could be the eye, the brain, the heart, the liver, muscle tissue. There are different types of viruses that have a certain affinity to these organs. And we engineer these viruses to, in some cases, increase the affinity to a certain target organ. And that ultimately is the delivery system that we utilize. Now, the payload of the virus is commonly the correct gene for that given condition. So commonly, you would see a genetic disease where a certain mutation is the cause of the disease. A lot of these are genetic diseases, in some cases, pediatric genetic diseases where, patients will experience mortality in the first couple of decades of life. And what we're doing with the gene therapies is to, correct those genetics and ultimately allows it to correct the disease. Now, when you're working at the genetic level, in a lot of cases, what this means is that this is a single administration therapy. So we're delivering the corrected gene, it corrects the genetics. And in most cases, this is almost a permanent correction of the genetics, which means it's a one-time treatment and could be a functional cure to that disease. So that's the promise of gene therapy, is that we can treat genetic conditions, we can correct the underlying genetics, and ultimately can allow them to be a functional cure to the disease. So this is our primary platform that we're utilizing. Now, we have decided to focus on, cardiovascular disease because we have I'd say, somewhat unique thesis about this disease area. And in large part, this thesis is based on some of the advances that have occurred in the oncology space. So when you look back a decade or two ago, we would look at cancer as one single, monolithic disease, but actually what's occurred is a better understanding of the genetics that sit behind these diseases, and then a focus on developing precision therapies, or therapies focused exclusively on that genetic profile of patient to treat these given diseases. The cardiovascular disease area is the same. We should not look at heart failure as a single disease. It's likely to be a collection of diseases that are mediated by different genetics. And I think the first wave of treatments in cardiovascular disease were, let's call them one-size-fits-all treatments. All patients were treated with, let's say, the same treatment regardless of their genetic profile. I think that is a paradigm that will change in cardiovascular disease, in particular as cardiologists begin to have access to genetic testing, and genetic testing becomes more routine in the treatment course for cardiac disease. I think we'll begin to find that a number of cardiac diseases are genetically mediated, and therefore we need treatments that focus on the underlying genetics of the disease. So that's where we're applying gene therapy to treat, cardiovascular disease, but focusing on the unique genetic, components of these diseases first. So our most advanced treatment is treating a disease called Friedreich's ataxia. In this therapy, we're treating both the cardiac and the neurologic disease. Our next most advanced treatment is treating a larger cardiac disease called arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. And then we have a range of other treatments behind this focused on different forms of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, dilated cardiomyopathy, and so on. So, in a way, we're taking kind of bite-sized chunks out of this much larger disease from a genetically mediated therapeutic framework. And I could envision the cardiovascular field looking a lot like oncology does today, where there's not one treatment or cure for cancer. There are, hundreds, and probably over time, thousands of cures, again, based on the genetic profile of the patients that are being treated.
And the space of gene therapy, of course, has evolved tremendously in the past decade or so. It went from being a proof of concept thing to now making it into clinics. And I think really we've been seeing a spur really of gene therapies making it to market. And how have you seen this space evolve, and what are your perspectives on it? And also, what are the challenges today in developing a gene therapy-based drug medicine?
Yeah, so it's been a roller coaster ride, I'd say, for the field. If you look at its early days, there was the death of a gene therapy patient in the 90s, Jesse Gelsinger. This basically caused the gene therapy field to, I'd say, recede from the perspective of outside, whether it's venture or other types of private or public equity investment. The gene therapy field then was continued to be advanced, but it was advanced in a handful of academic labs around the country. So this was labs at University of Pennsylvania, University of North Carolina, Cornell University, and a handful of others. And these academic labs became vertically integrated. They were doing everything from basic virology through to clinical studies. And that's where the field, developed and really incubated itself back into the form that we see today. And a lot of the early and recent gene therapy companies, the successes like Spark and Avexis and other companies, and including Lexeo, were effectively spin-outs from these vertically integrated, academic labs. And so that's, where I think the field in recent days got its start. But there were some limitations to the field basically maturing in the academic setting. And one of the limitations is that the academic labs did not spend a lot of time optimizing the manufacturing processes to ensure that they were efficient and that the cost of manufacturing was low. And, this is as compared to, for example, a pharmaceutical company where, one of their first goals would be to optimize manufacturing so they can manufacture at scale and at low cost to allow access to treatments, across the globe. So unfortunately for gene therapy, as these therapies, got into late stage clinical studies and approached commercialization, they did so with manufacturing processes that were effectively sourced from these academic labs and were not scaled, to benefit, large numbers of patients. So I think that's been one of the challenges of the gene therapy field. And this has been, evolving, has been developing. Lexeo has spent quite a bit of time and invested a lot of capital in optimizing a manufacturing process. I think we now have a manufacturing process that may allow the cost of goods for gene therapies to be close to that of biologics. So that's the level of innovation that industry can bring to a field. I think the second sort of consideration or challenge for gene therapy is, in a way, what I was describing earlier, in that it is a single administration treatment, potentially a functional cure to the disease. Today, most treatments, almost all treatments, are either a pill or an infusion. So the patient is consuming this treatment on a daily basis, a weekly basis, monthly basis, and so on for the entirety of their disease course, or in many cases for their whole lives. So our healthcare system is set up to reimburse treatments on that basis. It's not set up to reimburse treatments that are one-time potential functional cures to a disease. So in a lot of cases, and I would take, for example, the hemophilia B disease area, the gene therapy treatments there are multi-million-dollar treatments. However, if you look at the alternative treatment, that would be an infusion of a recombinant factor replacement product for the patient's entire life, you actually will save the healthcare system, millions of dollars over the course of that patient's life because of this single administration treatment that can be delivered to correct that disease. However, whether in the U.S., insurance companies, outside of the U.S., the governments that are paying for healthcare are not set up to accommodate a multi-million-dollar treatment, even though it will over time save them and save the healthcare system broadly money. So I think that's a second challenge that we have to address, generally as a society. What I say is I think this is what society always wanted from the biopharmaceutical industry. It wants us to develop cures to a disease. I mean, who wouldn't want to walk into a physician's office and in an outpatient treatment, walk out with a potential cure? But yet our payment and reimbursement systems are not yet set up to accommodate that. And unfortunately, it becomes a bit of a disincentive for people to develop treatments of this profile if they find that once they bring them to market, they run into substantial headwinds in getting them reimbursed by payers. So that's something that I think definitely needs to change and evolve. I think the third challenge is something that is, I'd say, maturing with time, and this is just a better understanding of the clinical profile of the gene therapy. So gene therapy's greatest strength is also its greatest weakness. Its greatest strength is that a single administration of the gene therapy can correct the genetics. And ultimately, this can, as I was describing, lead to functional cures to diseases. But this also means you cannot shut it off. So we have to find the perfect dose in clinical trials. And in some cases, if the dose is too high, you could have safety and toxicology side effects. If the dose is too low, the patient has not received an adequate amount of the therapeutic gene and ultimately the therapeutic protein. So I think that's just one of the natural challenges of gene therapy, is finding that perfect dose. And I think we're beginning with with more programs and more experience in the field from the clinical perspective. We're finding the types of diseases that are most amenable to gene therapy at safe doses. I would say for Lexeo, we're focused on cardiac disease in part because we found a delivery system or a vector that has a high affinity for the heart, so we can deliver these genetic payloads at safe doses. We've had a very compelling safety profile associated with our 2 gene therapies that are in the clinic. Our Friedreich's ataxia program, at the dose we're taking forward into our late stage studies and into commercialization, has had no treatment related serious adverse events associated with it. So it's actually notable in the absence of any serious adverse events, which, if you follow clinical trials, is an important feature from a safety perspective. And yet we're having a very dramatic benefit in the efficacy for this disease in Friedreich's ataxia. So I think those issues, manufacturing scale, commercial, reimbursement, pricing, and then just the kind of clinical risk profile of the gene therapies have been the challenges. But I would say the therapeutic benefit, the impact of these gene therapies on patients is, I'd say, frankly, undeniable. I use the example in spinal muscular atrophy, which is a disease where most patients would experience mortality by 2 years of age. The patients that have been treated with this gene therapy typically go on to live normal lives. The same in sickle cell. We hope for our gene therapy in Friedreich's ataxia to have the same degree of treatment impact, and certainly some of our early clinical data is showing that level of benefit. So I think there's more to come in terms of the impact that can be observed with the development of gene therapy. But I think the field is moving rapidly, as you described, and we have a handful of gene therapies approved today. If you play this forward, I think we're likely to see dozens in the future, and maybe hundreds over the coming decades.
It's wonderful to hear, and thank you so much for all of those very important perspectives and considerations in the gene therapy space today. In terms of Lexeo, I know that the company recently announced an $80 million equity financing round. And so how will this funding really accelerate your clinical and pipeline programs?
Yeah, so this raise comes after two private financings, an IPO, and then another public secondary raise. This $80 million of financing that we raised in May gives us a runway into 2028. It puts us on the other side of the data readout from our registrational study for the Friedreich's ataxia program, meaning we can, on the back of this financing, be in a position to submit our first BLA for a drug approval. So it's a very sort of exciting turning point for the company to move into a late-stage clinical trial that ultimately can support the approval of our first drug candidate into an actual commercial product. So that's it's an exciting financing because it gives us the runway to get to that commercial stage.
Mm-hmm. And also, the company also shared a new partnership to advance cardiac RNA-based therapeutics. Could you share a bit more about that collaboration as well?
Yeah. So, I think our thesis is that the AAV vector, as I described before, will be the tip of the spear in treating genetic cardiovascular disease. At the moment, it is the most efficient way to deliver genetic payloads to the heart. For the moment, lipid nanoparticles, certain antibodies, GalNAc, so on, cannot access the cardiomyocyte, whereas it appears that the AAV vector can have, can deliver genetic material to the heart, whether it's, DNA or RNA. However, we don't believe that this will always be the case, that this will be the only way to deliver, genetic payloads to the heart. We think that other modalities will emerge that will, can ultimately sit alongside the AAV vector to address, genetic conditions of the heart. So while AAV will be the tip of the spear, we think other modalities will emerge behind it. And non-virally delivered RNA therapeutics, we think, are one of the modalities that will emerge over time. And I'd say, Lexeo is a genetic medicines company, not necessarily exclusively a gene therapy company. So our goal is to find, the best delivery system and the optimal payload to address the conditions that we're targeting. And in some cases, it may not be that you need to correct the genetics of the disease. It may be that treating the disease at the RNA level is the appropriate way in which to address the condition. With that platform, we were focused on a set of cardiac diseases that would benefit from RNA delivered, non-virally. Now, in this, capital market environment, however, for biotech, which has been, I think, a tough tape for both public and private companies, what it's resulted in is high costs of capital for capital raises. What this means is that there's a high hurdle rate for the programs that you do ultimately apply this capital to. And what this high hurdle rate means is you need to focus on the most mature programs or the programs with the highest probability of success. And so what that typically means for a company of our profile is that, the preclinical programs need to sort of take a back seat to the clinical stage and later stage programs. And I think we certainly found that to be the case, that we were developing some very interesting early science in, non-viral RNA, but we weren't able to apply sufficient, capital to it to, let it sort of mature at the right, at an appropriate pace. And yet it was very intriguing, very interesting science. And so we decided to partner with two leading venture funds to form a new company that would focus exclusively on developing this non-viral technology with RNA delivery. And I'd say this, this is obviously private capital, venture capital. It's, I think, frankly, much more patient capital than what we would expect, from the public markets. So it can, wait 3, 4, 5 years to see, de-risking of this very interesting and novel platform, and ultimately would have the patience to, to see that all through. Now, our team is involved with this company from the research perspective, and ultimately Lexeo retains both an equity position in this company, but also importantly opt-in rights to programs that will come out of this new company. So it may be that programs that come out of this company will find their way into Lexeo's pipeline in the future. So I think it for us was the best of both worlds. It allowed this technology to advance with the right let's say capital structure around it. But ultimately allow us the opportunity to potentially access these programs in the future as they mature. So I think it's a solution that kind of fits the times of less capital. You need to develop innovative solutions to meet the same goals. And this is what we did with this new company that we created alongside these two leading venture funds.
And in terms of partnerships, I think that's just a great example of really how you mentioned that you had this platform and didn't necessarily have the scope, the time, the financing to further explore it, given your focus on the viral vector delivery platform. And partnering with companies just makes so much sense, where you can share resources, efforts to really, spearhead development of therapies and projects. And so in terms of that ecosystem in drug development, how do you see that today? How important are those collaborations, partnerships? And you also mentioned patient advocacy groups as well. So really there are a lot of different stakeholders at the table. So who are those stakeholders, and how important is it to engage with them? How do you engage with them appropriately? And could you just tell us a bit more about that ecosystem in drug development today and how that's changed from perhaps in the past?
Yeah, so I'll just kind of outline the structure, and I won't probably talk about all of the ecosystem, but maybe some of the most important aspects. So I would say there's, a biotech company, a clinical stage biotech company, is sitting at the epicenter of the investors that provide the capital, So this is either private investors or public investors. I would also potentially put pharma in the picture as an investor. They can invest in the venture context, but in a lot of cases, their investment comes in the form of partnership dollars into biotechnology companies. We think of patients and patient advocacy groups as collaborators. They're very important thought partners in understanding the challenges of a given disease and what type of therapeutic solution will make the most sense for either themselves or if these are patients of children, these are parents of children, the child that they're that they're obviously the caregiver for. Physicians are a very important audience for us as well. They help us to understand the existing standard of care in the disease and how a certain therapy that we're advancing may change that standard of care. And I think if you're looking for a dramatic change in the standard of care, the physicians are the population that will, tell you if your therapy can have that type of impact, for patients. And then you look on the other side at the FDA, obviously as our regulator, but also in some cases we like to think of them as a collaborator. And this is very important in rare diseases where there's no treatment ahead of some of the diseases that we're developing. So the regulatory path is completely unknown, uncharted. So we have to work with the FDA to innovate in terms of what are the right endpoints that demonstrate the value of the treatment, and how do we get there in the most efficient and most predictable manner is some of the topics that ultimately are being discussed with the FDA. So that's, I think, at a high level, where you think about partnership and collaboration. Maybe I'll focus on first just the pharmaceutical partnership and collaboration front, because I think that's probably the most common place that many companies would go if they were thinking about partnership and collaboration. So I think there's an important role for the pharmaceutical sector to play in helping to advance therapeutics, even ones that they don't develop within their own walls. So I talked about at the outset sort of the global scale that pharmaceutical companies have in respect to commercialization. If you look at in many large pharmaceutical companies, they'll have commercial organizations in over 80 countries around the world. It is difficult. I don't want to say impossible, but it will take years and a lot of capital for a biotechnology company to build that type of commercial scale. So why not leverage the commercial scale of an existing pharmaceutical company to ensure broad global access of your therapeutic that you're developing as a biotech company. So I think a lot of partnerships are formed on that basis of as you approach commercialization, is it feasible to commercialize your therapy in 80 countries around the world yourself, or should you leverage the existing scale of the pharmaceutical company? And this is mutually beneficial. I mean, they have in a lot of cases, they being the pharmaceutical companies, have a lot of fixed costs sitting in those countries, fixed costs, country organization, sales, marketing, market access, and so on. So to the extent they can add more revenue into those fixed cost infrastructures, it's something that drops directly to their bottom line. And at the same time, the biotech company probably doesn't want to raise capital at a, frankly, today, high cost of capital to build an identical organization to what already exists in many of these countries. So I think that's one place where partnerships certainly materialize for biotech companies. The other one is if you go, a little bit earlier and think about, the clinical setting. I think, for rare diseases, the capital exists that biotechnologies can access in the public markets to, run their own clinical trials from, phase 1 through to pivotal studies. And so I think this is commonplace that, most biotech companies would sort of kind of go on their own with clinical trials because the capital needs for many rare diseases are more modest. But imagine the biotechnology company that's trying to develop a treatment for Alzheimer's disease, where the cost of late stage development are not very modest. And we are one of those companies that has an Alzheimer's pipeline. So we could be looking at a $1 to $2 billion pivotal study or a confirmatory study for a disease like Alzheimer's. And obviously, this is a very different amount of capital to raise relative to raising, capital to support a rare disease late stage study. So that's where a potential pharmaceutical partner could come into the picture, where, if you're looking at a development path that if you were to go out and try to raise $2 billion, even if you could raise it, would you want to dilute your shareholders to that extent? Where the alternative could be forming a development partnership with a deep-pocketed pharma partner who can actually fund the late-stage development of that therapy, and that company ultimately benefits from some of the downstream economics, whether they be royalties on the revenue or milestone payments from certain target certain target sales amounts. So benefits from a lot of the upside of if the therapy ultimately makes it to market, but doesn't necessarily need to absorb the risk and, frankly, just the high amount of capital that's required to get that therapy to an approval. So I think those are the two flavors of treatments that you typically see in the biotechnology field, commercial and clinical. I think in this capital markets environment, probably companies will, consider partnerships earlier and will consider them more frequently than they would in a different market environment. And it's a pure cost of capital question. If your cost of capital is 10%, you may go out and raise the money because the hurdle rate is let's say sitting above 10%. The cost of capital is 25%. You may opt not to go out and raise that capital in the equity markets, and you would instead opt to pursue a partnership. So I think the partnership interest that companies would consider will increase and decrease with where the markets are sitting in respect to cost of capital. And I think in the last few years, we have been in, kind of one of the most significant biotechnology equity market downturns in, the last few decades. So probably, more companies are open to partnerships. Frankly, probably more companies are open to being acquired than they would have been in prior markets, all for these reasons. So I think the, pharmaceutical sector obviously plays a very important role in ensuring that, high quality assets that have the right therapeutic profile ultimately find their way to patients on the other end.
Thank you so much for those really insightful considerations and perspectives. Once again, really setting the stage and really giving us a great understanding of the landscape where it is currently. And so, what can we expect in the coming year and beyond in the next couple of years from Lexeo? What are some of the things that you're most excited about, and what can we keep an eye out for here at Xtalks and our audiences, of course?
I'd say first, broadly, I'm excited to see the thesis that we have around genetic cardiovascular disease begin to play out. We have the potential to have the first gene therapy for cardiovascular disease, commercially approved. This will be an exciting milestone in that, cardiologists will begin to leverage some of the most advanced technology to treat genetically mediated cardiac diseases. And hopefully we start with our Friedreich's ataxia program and then, move successively into our arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy program. Then we'd hope to have the, preclinical pipeline that we're developing, begin to mature and follow these other therapies into market. And I would hope to see a paradigm where, as I described, the cardiovascular field through our work and the work of, other companies begins to have, more efficient treatment options for patients that are, suffering from cardiovascular disease globally. I think, again, the first set of therapies will be gene therapies, likely mediated by adeno-associated virus, but I think we're likely to see a range of other therapeutic options emerge. And this will, ultimately sit alongside, existing cardiovascular treatments, but maybe over time it will replace existing cardiovascular treatments, because the likelihood of the treatment effect being so much more dramatic when you're focused on the underlying genetics of the disease is high. Relative to just focusing on more symptom-based, treatments that, which is the level at which we're typically working, today. So we're excited to see that thesis begin to play out. And then, at a more individual disease level, I would be excited to see Friedreich's ataxia patients have access to a treatment that can address the cause of death in that disease, right? So the existing commercially approved therapy treats the neurologic component of the disease, but the cause of death in Friedreich's ataxia is heart failure. Typically, it's cardiac disease. So our treatment is addressing both the neurologic disease and the cardiac disease. So I'd be excited to, see that therapy reach the market. I'd be excited to see a treatment effect or therapeutic profile that ultimately changes the disease course for patients who are living beyond their third decade of life, and they go on to live, normal or as close to normal, happy lives as they can. I mean, I think that's why myself and a lot of, colleagues that are working with us at Lexeo really got into this business. I mean, there's a lot of other things we could have gone to go do, but, I think there's colleagues that I work with that are, including myself, that are, very, very passionate about delivering therapies for patients with rare diseases. And to see that occur, to see that all materialize after, years and years of hard work and ups and downs and so on, will be an exciting, moment for the company. And then, we have more therapies of a similar profile coming, behind it. And that impact for every patient group that we're seeking to address will be just as meaningful, even if it's our second program, our third product approved, or our second product approved, or our third one or fourth, and so on. And ultimately, I think that will change how people think about cardiovascular disease, and we'll be looking at a very different field in the future.
Nolan, first off, I'd like to thank you so much for everything that you do, the incredible work that you're leading at Lexeo, and really your passion really shines through. So thank you so much once again for all of the work that you're spearheading at Lexeo, and we look forward to all of those milestones and making a difference in patients' lives. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for your time here to share all of those insights with us. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It was great to be on today.
All right, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next week with another special guest as we had today. Thank you so much.
To join the Xtalks community, visit xtalks.com and register for exclusive access to curated content like live webinars, news articles, and educational videos. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policy or position of Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.